The smell of gun smoke cut through the antiseptic like a blade through silk. Isadora Fenn pressed her palm flat against Cael Draven's forearm, forcing steady pressure over the 2-inch gash running along the inside of his wrist, and she did not let her hands shake. Not in this room, not with him watching. Outside the reinforced door of the yacht's lower medical suite, automatic gunfire snapped in tight professional bursts. Something heavy hit the deck above them. A man yelled once, then stopped. "You need stitches," she said, because stating the obvious was the only thing keeping her grounded. Cael's eyes moved from the wound to her face. They were a flat, storm cloud grey, and they carried no more expression than the gun resting on the steel table beside him. The scarring on the right side of his face caught the emergency lighting and turned it amber, a topographic landscape of old damage running from his jaw up through his cheekbone, curling into the outer edge of his eyebrow. His right hand, the one not currently bleeding, bore the same marks. Burn scars. Thorough, merciless, permanent. He looked like something forged, not born. "Then stitch it," he said. 6 weeks ago, Isadora had been a nurse practitioner at a quiet family medicine clinic in Burlington, Vermont, scheduling flu vaccines and writing blood pressure scripts. She had not planned to end up in international waters, suturing a crime lord's arm while men with automatic weapons cleared the deck above her head. Her father, Dr. Warren Fenn, had planned it for her. The way Warren tended to handle things he was ashamed of, quietly at a distance, without consulting the people most affected. 3 years earlier, her father had performed an unauthorized, off-the-books surgery on a man brought to him after midnight, a man whose people had made very clear that a hospital was not an option. The man had been Cael Draven. The surgery had saved his liver and probably his life. Warren had told no one, accepted no payment, and spent 3 years pretending it hadn't happened. Pretending had a shelf life. When Cael's men arrived at Warren's house on a Tuesday in October, her father had not offered money. He had offered Isadora. Not as a bride. Cael, she would learn, had been perfectly clear that he required no wife. What he required was a medic, someone trained, someone who could be trusted not to report him or poison him, someone with every reason to keep her mouth shut, because her father's quiet little secret would collapse them both if it surfaced. The iron gates of the Draven compound rose at the edge of the Oregon coast, 40 miles south of any town worth naming. The estate sat on a bluff above the Pacific, a converted 1920s resort hotel that had been gutted and rebuilt into something that looked like a luxury retreat. If you didn't notice the ballistic glass in the windows, or the men walking the perimeter with their hands never far from their sides, Isadora noticed. She was met at the main entrance by a man named Zeb, broad-shouldered, quiet, with a scar through his upper lip that suggested someone had once tried to shut him up and failed. He carried her single rolling suitcase without being asked and led her through a foyer floored in dark slate. Past walls hung with photographs of the Oregon coastline that looked like they'd been taken in winter, all grey sea and stripped trees. "Mr. Draven is in the East Wing," Zeb said. He had the kind of voice that filled a room without effort. The East Wing had been a conservatory once. The glass ceiling was now reinforced with a steel framework, and morning light fell in pale sheets across a hospital-grade examination table that had been installed alongside a mahogany desk covered in maps and encrypted tablets. The room smelled of salt air and the particular chemical sharpness of medical-grade ointment. Cael Draven stood at the window with his back to her. He was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a black thermal that did nothing to disguise the kind of build that came from disciplined, functional use rather than vanity. When he turned, the scarring registered first, the way unexpected things always did. Her clinical mind catalogued it automatically. 2nd and 3rd degree burns, right side dominant, healed without optimal grafting, significant texture disruption to the cheek and temple. Her human mind registered something else entirely, an absolute stillness in his expression that said he had watched people react to his face hundreds of times and had long since stopped caring about any of them. "Isadora Fenn," he said, not a question. "That's me," she said, which was not the professional opening she'd rehearsed in the car. Something shifted at the corner of his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Sit down, Miss Fenn." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap the way she did when she was trying not to look nervous. The arrangement, as he outlined it, was simple. The assassination attempt 18 months ago had caused nerve trauma to his right hand beyond the visible scarring. Intermittent loss of grip strength, chronic pain, occasional tremors under stress. He required consistent treatment, physical therapy protocols, monitoring for 2 graft sites that had not fully stabilized. He could not go to a hospital. He would not. In exchange, her father's name stayed buried, and she would want for nothing within the compound. "Am I a prisoner?" Isadora asked, and she was proud of how level her voice stayed. Cael studied her for a moment. "You are a professional. I am compensating in a currency your father selected. The compound has grounds. You may use them. You may not leave without a security detail." He turned back to the window. "Whether you call it captivity is your own business." The weeks that followed had their own brutal rhythm. She ran his therapy sessions twice a week. She monitored the graft sites. She tracked the tremor frequency in his right hand with the same clinical precision she brought to everything. And Cael endured it with a locked jaw, rigid silence that communicated everything about how much he despised needing her. He never complained. He also never made it easy. She began learning the household's geography by its silences. There was Zeb, who was loyal in the way old Timber was loyal, structural, absolute. And then there was Gregor Thane, Cael's second-in-command, who moved through the compound with the ease of a man who had already mentally redecorated it. Gregor was handsome in a polished, overlit way, always in a suit that was slightly too expensive, and he looked at Cael's right hand the way certain people looked at aging relatives, calculating what came next. Isadora noticed. She noticed, too, that Cael noticed her noticing. He said nothing about it. He said very little about most things that mattered. The trouble came on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the conservatory reviewing therapy charts when Gregor walked in without knocking, which he did frequently as though he were rehearsing habits appropriate for a different role. He tossed a tablet onto the desk without preamble. "Pell is pushing into the Vancouver corridor. We go north, we hit back hard, we make an example." Cael didn't look at the tablet. "Pell is baiting a reaction. If we move north, we break the Morrison Treaty and hand him legal cover to escalate. We shut his financing in Reno instead." Gregor leaned on the desk in a way that was almost insolent. "The men are watching you, Cael." His eyes moved, briefly, to the compression glove on Cael's right hand, to the therapy equipment along the wall. "They see you in here, and they start asking questions about the future of this organization. Let me handle the north. You focus on getting better." The room temperature dropped without anyone touching a thermostat. Cael turned his grey eyes to Gregor, slowly. "Do you want to finish that thought?" he asked, very quietly. Gregor raised both hands in mock deference, just looking out for the family. He walked out. Cael said nothing afterward. His right hand rested on the desk, and Isadora watched the tendons tighten, then deliberately release. She moved to retrieve the tablet Gregor had left at the edge of the desk. "Leave it," he said. "It's about to fall." I said, "Leave it," not loud. She left it. She walked to the supply counter and began reorganizing a tray that didn't need reorganizing, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the fury rolling off him from across the room was not directed at her, and she understood the difference between a man who was dangerous and a man who was in pain. "I don't need you to manage the room," he said after a moment. "I'm reorganizing gauze," she said without turning around. "It has nothing to do with you." A silence. "Look at me," he said. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, not the calculation, not the cold authority. Something rawer, something that had weight. "Don't pity me," he said. "Not for the hand, not for the face, not for any of it." "I don't pity you, Mr. Draven." She held his gaze without blinking. I find you deeply inconvenient. That's a different thing entirely." He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to his work, but something in his shoulders had changed. "There's a charity event Saturday," he said without looking up. "The Meridian Foundation benefit. We'll be attending. You'll accompany me." "As your nurse." "As my guest," he said in a tone that closed the subject. The Meridian Foundation benefit was held aboard the Sovereign Star, a 200-foot superyacht anchored in the Columbia River outside Portland. Neutral water, in theory, where the city's most dangerous people gathered annually to write checks that purchased legitimacy and smile at one another over champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Isadora wore navy blue. She had not brought a gown to a crime lord's coastal compound, so one had arrived in a garment bag outside her door Saturday morning, fitted silk crepe, high neck understated. The kind of choice that said someone had looked at her carefully before ordering it. She didn't ask who. Cael met her in the entry hall. He wore charcoal, no tie, his scarred right hand in the fitted compression glove she'd prescribed. He looked at her once, said nothing, and the car was already waiting. The yacht was every surface that could gleam, gleaming. Chandeliers, champagne flutes, the open faces of Portland's philanthropic class masking whatever they actually did with their money. Isadora stayed close to Cael's side. She was good at reading rooms. Clinics had taught her that, and this room was watching him, not all of it kindly. Aldous Pell found them near the aft bar. He was a silver-haired man whose stomach suggested he'd long since stopped doing his own dirty work, and his pale eyes moved over everything like a livestock appraiser. He reached for Cael's left hand deliberately when he extended his own, with a smile that had no warmth behind it. "Draven," Pell said. "Good to see you out. We'd heard the compound was good for your recuperation." "My health is excellent," Cael said. "Your financing operation in Reno, on the other hand." Pell's smile tightened at the edges. He shifted his gaze to Isadora, and the way it moved over her made her want to take a step back. She didn't. "The private nurse," Pell said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just thought of something cutting. "Must be good work. Keeping a man company when he can't quite." He gestured vaguely toward Cael's right hand, as though the thought completed itself. Isadora had not planned what happened next. She didn't consult a strategy. She simply turned to face Aldous Pell and spoke in the voice she used when a patient's family member was being obstructive in a way that was going to hurt someone. "Mr. Pell," she said pleasantly, "a man's hand tells you what he built and what it cost him to build it. Most people who've never built anything worth protecting mistake that cost for weakness. It isn't." She smiled. "I understand the confusion. It takes a certain depth of perception to see past the surface. Clearly, that's not everyone's gift." Pell blinked. Cael said nothing, but she felt the shift in him beside her, something that had been wound tightly, releasing by a single careful degree. "Your wife has a mouth on her," Pell said to Cael. "She has accuracy," Cael replied, "which you'll find is more inconvenient." Pell scoffed and turned away. Gregor appeared at Cael's shoulder, expression tight and low. "You let her speak to Pell like that." "She spoke the truth," Cael said, "something this room needed." Then the lights died. The darkness lasted 1 second, long enough for the collective intake of breath across 200 guests, before automatic weapons fire tore through the starboard side of the yacht. People screamed. Glass exploded inward. Someone dropped to the floor beside Isadora before she'd fully processed that she needed to be on the floor too. A hand closed around her arm and pulled. "Down," Cael said, his mouth an inch from her ear, and he had her low and moving before she'd finished understanding the instruction. The chaos was total, bodies surging, the crack of gunfire in tight professional bursts, not panicked, not random. Targeted, coordinated, this was not a robbery. Cael had a gun. She didn't know where it had come from or where he'd been carrying it, but his left hand moved with complete, unhurried certainty as he got them through a service door, down a staircase, into the vessel's lower deck. She stopped counting the shots fired above them because it was not helping her breathe. The medical suite was 3 corridors down. She knew because she'd memorized the vessel's layout when they'd boarded, which she now understood had been less professional habit and more a survival instinct she'd been developing without knowing it. She got the door open. He came through behind her and she threw the bolt. He sat on the examination table. His left hand steadied against the wall, and she saw it then, the gash on his right forearm where the compression glove ended. A fragment of something had caught him just below the wrist during the chaos. She opened the medical kit. Her hands did not shake. That was the particular mercy of training. The body learned steadiness independently of the mind. Her mind was in a separate room, cycling through something that felt like fear but had not yet broken surface. Cael watched her thread the suture needle. "Gregor sold the security layout," he said, not a question. "How do you know?" she began the first stitch. 4 people had the full layout of this event. One of them is currently not responding to radio. 2 others I'd trust with my life. And Gregor has been in contact with Pel's people for 6 months. His voice was even. A man updating a record, not expressing emotion. "You knew." "I suspected, now I know." A pause. "There's a difference." Footsteps in the corridor, paired, deliberate, voices murmuring in short clipped sentences, clearing rooms. Isadora tied off the last suture. She stood. She moved toward the door, and she was not entirely certain what she intended to do when she got there, but she had her hands and her training and a supply cabinet that contained at minimum 3 things that could function as weapons if she needed them to. "Isadora." She turned. He reached for her, not the hard grip she'd half expected, but something precise. His hand curved around the side of her face, and she was standing in front of him, and his grey eyes were very close, and the scarring she'd stopped registering weeks ago was just his face now, just the face of the man watching her with an expression that had finally set down every defense it usually carried. "I am not a man who breaks," he said very quietly. The hand against her face was steady. "Not when they put me in that car, not now. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She understood all of it. The way his men looked at the compression glove. The way Gregor had looked at the physical therapy equipment like it was evidence of something. The way Pel had reached for the left hand, not the right, to communicate that he knew exactly where the damage was. She understood what it cost a man like Cael Draven to sit still while someone else's hands were more reliable than his own. She understood that he was not asking her to believe he was invincible. He was asking her to see him clearly and not look away. "I see you," she said, which was not what she'd planned, but it was the only true thing in the room. His eyes dropped to her mouth for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then the door handle rattled, and Zeb's voice came through the radio on the counter, and the moment became something that would have to wait. What followed was fast and contained. Zeb secured the corridor. The radio confirmed the upper deck was controlled. There was a route out through the engine room, and they took it. And 40 minutes later, Isadora was in the back of a black vehicle heading away from the river, while Portland's emergency frequencies lit up behind them. The safe house was a reinforced warehouse outside Salem, exposed steel beams, industrial lighting, folding tables that had clearly hosted difficult conversations before. Within 2 hours, it was a command center. Encrypted laptops open on every surface, Zeb moving between screens. Men she'd seen around the compound arriving through a secondary entrance in 2s and 3s. Isadora had expected to be given a room and told to wait. She was not. Cael looked at her once across the main room and simply did not exclude her. She sat at the far end of the steel table with a medical kit open in front of her, and she watched him work, and it was a different kind of surgery than anything she had ever performed. Bloodless, remote, and entirely merciless. He spoke in short, exact sentences. His left hand moved across maps and screens with precision. His right hand, even with its compromised grip, held phones and stabilized tablets with the particular economy of someone who had learned to adapt without announcing the adaptation. He took Aldous Pell apart piece by piece over the course of the night. Financial channels, distribution networks, a supply infrastructure Pell had spent 3 years building, reduced to legal liability and empty warehouses by dawn. The men in the room stopped looking at his hand. They started looking at his face when he spoke, and not at the scars. At 3 a.m, Isadora brought him coffee. He was alone at the table for the first time in hours, studying a satellite image of a warehouse district across the river. "Gregor is there?" she asked. "Gregor is there," Cael said. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The right one held its grip. She noted it and said nothing. "He has 14 men. He thinks I'll send a team." She understood before he said it. "You're going yourself?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Then I'll be on the other end of the radio, and your dressing needs to be changed before you go anywhere." He looked back at her. Something in his expression shifted. The way it had in the yacht's medical suite, that careful lowering of something he kept elevated. "When I come back," he said, "this ends." "The arrangement," she said. The pretense that it's only an arrangement, very quiet, very deliberate. Her pulse did something she chose not to analyze. "Come back then," she said. The warehouse on the Washington side of the river was a commercial labyrinth. Shelving units, palletized inventory, loading bays, the kind of building that swallowed operations in its interior and looked unremarkable from the street. Gregor Thane waited inside with 14 men and the particular nervous energy of someone who had rehearsed a confrontation so many times that the real thing felt performative. He had not rehearsed for Cael walking in alone. "You came by yourself," Gregor said, and he couldn't quite contain the surprise beneath the contempt. "Look at this. The great Cael Draven walking into a building with 14 guns and 1 good hand." Cael stopped in the center of the room. 16, he said. Gregor's expression shifted. "What?" "You recruited 16 men, Gregor. 2 months ago in Tacoma, I know, because I recruited them 3 months ago." He let that settle. "In this business, the men who work for the highest bidder work for whoever bids first." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before it broke. Not with gunfire, but with the sound of 16 safeties clicking off simultaneously and 16 weapons rotating away from Cael and toward Gregor's inner circle. Every man in the room turning. Gregor turned in a slow, disbelieving circle. The color left his face. "You spent 6 months calculating what I couldn't do anymore," Cael said, moving forward 1 measured step at a time. His voice was quiet, and in the cavernous space it carried everywhere. "You looked at the hand and you looked at the face and you decided the math had changed. You forgot to check what I'd already done while you were busy looking." Gregor's hand went for the gun at his hip. The firing pin struck an empty chamber. He racked the slide, pulled again. Click. "These scars don't make me a ghost," Cael said. "They prove I survived something you arranged. That is a distinction I have not forgotten, even if you hoped I had." Gregor's voice, when it came, had lost everything that had made it confident. "Cael, listen. Pell manipulated me, I swear on." Cael fired once. The compound was quiet when the van came back through the gates before dawn. The Pacific beyond the bluff had gone the deep silver black of very early morning, and the wind off the water carried the smell of rain still hours away. Isadora was at the entry, had been for nearly an hour, which she was not going to pretend was accidental. She saw him through the windshield before the vehicle stopped. She crossed to him when he stepped out, not running because she was still herself, but without hesitation, and she put both hands against his chest before he'd fully turned, checking for what she already knew wasn't there, because Zeb had confirmed by radio 20 minutes ago, but her hands needed to verify independently what her mind had been told. "You're not injured," she said. "I'm not injured. Your dressing still needs to be changed." "I know." Something close to quiet amusement moved across his face. His right hand came up and covered both of hers where they rested against his chest. The grip was steady. She felt each finger, the resistance in them, the particular pressure of a hand that had relearned itself over 18 months of therapy and will. She looked up at him. The east was beginning to pale behind the tree line. The scarring caught the first grey of morning, without apology, without softening, the same way it caught every light, as fact, not flaw. "What did you mean," she said, "when you said it ends?" "The pretense that you're still here because you have to be," he said. She thought about Burlington, the quiet clinic, the careful, bounded life she'd been building in deliberate steps away from everything her father had decided for her. She thought about arriving at these gates 6 weeks ago with one rolling suitcase and a controlled expression and a bone-deep certainty that she would get through this by treating it clinically, at a professional remove, the way she treated everything that threatened to matter. She thought about the moment she had turned to Aldous Pell on that yacht deck and meant every word she'd said. She thought about a man sitting in a warehouse at 3 a.m. who had looked at her across a steel table full of maps and simply not excluded her. "I'm still here," she said. It was not a complicated sentence, but Cael Draven was a man who had learned to read what went unsaid, and he read it correctly. His hand tightened over hers. The other came up to the side of her face, that same careful, deliberate touch, and he held her the way someone holds something they have decided they are not letting go of. The Pacific crashed against the rocks below the bluff. The rain was coming. Neither of them moved toward the door. The world had watched Cael Draven's face and his hand, and the compression glove, and the physical therapy sessions, and it had decided the math had changed, that damage visible on the surface meant damage all the way through. It had watched and calculated and circled, and while it was busy watching, he had been building something it wasn't looking at. Isadora had not made that mistake. She had looked at the surface and looked past it and arrived, without quite planning to, at the same place. In the grey morning light on the Oregon coast, with the Pacific loud below them, and his hands holding hers like something decided rather than something asked. She understood it the way she understood a diagnosis when all the evidence finally aligned. She had not come here because of her father's debt. She had come here because some debts are just the door, and what waits on the other side of it was never about the money.